Welcome to Sanctuary, the church and LGBTQ plus people in this moment. I'm Artie Hartzell, and today's program is offered through Pride Education Services, which seeks to make spaces safer and more accessible and more inclusive for LGBTQ plus employees, clients, members, and customers, and support leaders in delivering inclusive services and doing public outreach for LGBTQ plus communities. We also work with organization through meeting facilitation, strategic planning, and team building, as well as issue advocacy, strategy, and tactics, all beyond LGBTQ inclusion, but obviously with equity in mind at all times. We serve churches, advocacy nonprofits, drug service nonprofits, and healthcare providers, businesses that serve the public, elected officials, community organizations, and anyone who's looking to grow in this area. Project Embodied Welcome, or PEW, is our faith-based program. We serve churches and church leaders by meeting them wherever they are on their journey towards LGBTQ plus inclusion, from study to implementation, including workshops, consulting and coaching, writing, equity and asset auditing, pulpit supply, website design and creation, and outreach. I'm Artie Hartzell. I am the founding principal of Pride Education Services. I have undergrad and graduate degrees in social work, and I'm currently pursuing a Master's of Divinity. I have direct social work practice with youth at an LGBTQ youth center, with foster care families, with adults with HIV, and I have professional advocacy experience in voting rights and LGBTQ issues at the local, state, and federal levels, and volunteer advocacy as well in LGBTQ issues. And I have a faith background that's very congregationalist and supports the separation of church and state. Originally, my church growing up was Southern Baptist. We were removed from the Southern Baptist Convention for baptizing 2 gay men, and we joined the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. However, the church currently is a little more eclectic on the congregational side. I am very well versed and experienced in church politics and how decisions are made, and can lead churches through studies and congregational decisions. Today, we're going to talk about some foundational language just to make sure that we're all starting from the same place as far as words and concepts that we're going to be referring to and using. Usually, we would go way more in depth on this language and concepts portion to really help people feel comfortable using it. But this is just to make sure that this specific topic today, as we're discussing it, you understand the words we're using. We'll also cover the legislative landscape and talk some about cultural landscape as well, the impact of the legislative and cultural landscape, and actions we can take to address the current situation. So to start with foundational language terms and concepts, I want to first identify the acronym SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. SOGI is an acronym that is not used colloquially, usually in like social contexts. It's usually used in academia, law, policy, healthcare, fields like that. And when we talk about data, a lot of times we're referring to sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. Again, a lot of times when we're referring to SOGI, the connotation is that we are referring to LGBTQ people, but everyone has a sexual orientation, a gender identity, and gender expression. And it's important to remember that because it helps you relate to the topic more, and it also tries to move the default of straight, heterosexual, cisgender, and we'll define all these words, from the center to more of a circle so that we can all access the same language to describe our experiences and identities. For example, we all have sexual orientation. LGBT people are not the only people with sexual orientation. Heterosexual people have sexual orientation too. It just describes a person's potential sexual, romantic, or emotional attraction to another person based on their genders. And you'll see that really refers to lesbians, because with lesbian, you're referring to your gender and the gender of the people you're potentially attracted to. So very simplified, you're a woman and you're potentially attracted to other women. Now, gay is an umbrella term kind of for our entire community, and is often used interchangeably with queer or LGBTQ+. It at one point was the only word when the LGBTQ community started defining ourselves. it was the word that we reclaimed. And then lesbians carved themselves out of gay, and gay kind of stood for men who were attracted to other men. And bisexual is an umbrella term. You may see the phrase or word bi plus, bi plus symbol, and that refers specifically to people who have the potential of being attracted to people of two or more genders. And those two genders could be genders like mine or genders not like mine. There could also just be two or more other genders that people are attracted to. You may have seen or heard words like pansexual or omnisexual. These words fall under the bisexual umbrella and are newer, but try to identify that specific experience a little bit more uniquely and finitely. And some people really want to do that in order to find people who are experiencing similar things to them, or to be able to describe their experience with clarity and being concise. Some people will just say gay, queer, lesbian, bi as kind of a more generalization of their identity. Gender identity describes a person's internal sense of gender and whether they identify with the gender they were assigned at birth or not. We all have gender identity, especially those of us who have taken the time to review our internal experiences of gender, and if like what certain words feel like, and where we feel like we fall in relation to the gender we were assigned at birth. You may not have thought about it, and if you haven't thought about it, maybe take some time to do it and see where you land. So cisgender people actually identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. So if you were assigned male at birth, you would be a cis man or a cisgender man, being with cisgender being an adjective and cis the root meaning on the same side of. Transgender, with trans being the root, means to cross over. And again, it's an adjective. So not a transgender, not a verb, not transgendered, and or transgendering. It is an adjective. So transgender men, transgender women. And it's always two words. So trans women is two words. Trans men is two words. And a trans man would be a person who was assigned female at birth and identifies as a man. But when we talk about trans men, we don't say identifies as, we say they are men. Trans just describes the experience of their particular manhood. So we don't need to say identifies as. If we want to emphasize that they are trans, we say they are a trans man, because trans is an adjective like white or poor or disabled. It just describes the experience. So white man, trans man, cis man, poor man explains that some of the experience of that particular man's journey. In the same way, cisgender would describe that specific experience. So when you hear certain women say that trans women are taking from the woman's experience, we have to remember that women do not have a monolithic experience. And a trans woman experience is different from a cis woman experience, but there are lots of different experiences that make up womanhood. Non-binary refers to people who are not aligning with the binary genders of male or female. They may reject the notion entirely. They may identify outside of it or without gender, or they may be fluid between genders, or even not just the two genders, but with other genders as well. And you would say non-binary person, because non-binary again is a adjective. It's also an umbrella term. There are other non-binary genders that fall underneath it, but a lot of people will just call themselves non-binary. Non-binary comes under the trans umbrella as well. And some non-binary people will say they don't identify as trans, but on the generalization, we do include non-binary people with trans people. Now, trans people, non-binary people may or may not pursue legal or medical interventions for transition. So hormones, surgeries, legal documentation changes for a multitude of reasons. It's very, very expensive. People may not want to. You can identify a certain way and not want to make a certain surgical intervention on your body or hormonal intervention on your body. there again, there are multiple reasons: oppression, discrimination. Some people need to stay on the side of their assigned birth for safety. That doesn't change the validity of their gender. People may transition socially, like change their name and pronouns and come out. That's probably what you'll see with youth more than likely, and with other folks in your community. That is what you go based off of. When someone tells you their gender, just accept it and believe them. Gender expression, again, something we all have. It describes the way we outwardly express our gender, and it describes decisions we make every day, including the way we dress, the way we walk and talk, our mannerisms, and it may deviate from expectations. For instance, a butch lesbian identifies as a woman, but presents herself more masculinely. You may have heard there was a time when a phrase, metrosexual, was going around to describe heterosexual men who took extra time to take care of themselves and hygiene in their face and hair. There are plenty of ways to be gender nonconforming, and all of us are gender nonconforming in some way. Most of us do not fully meet the gender expectations that are aligned with our gender identity. And when we are referring to trans people, that's true too. A trans man may want to wear makeup. A trans woman may want to have short hair and be a butch or be butch. There are lots of different ways to express ourselves. And it doesn't change who we are through our gender identity. Now, I have intersectionality here kind of as a footnote, and I don't want us to treat it as a footnote. So again, usually in our workshops and trainings, we'll go really in depth into intersectionality and talk about how it impacts everything we're talking about as we go along. Because this is such a specific topic, I want us to think about the way this concept impacts the current landscape and what people are experiencing. So intersectionality is a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and she used it to describe the ways areas of oppression and privilege meet one another and interact with one another within a single person's experience. So, for instance, if we have a man named Bob, and he is white, and he is Christian, and he is wealthy, those are three privileges that Bob enters the world with. He's white, Christian, wealthy. Now, say he's disabled. Say he's LGBTQ. Being disabled and LGBTQ changed the way he experiences being a man, being wealthy, being Christian, right? Those privileges also interact with how he experiences oppression. So his experiences as an LGBTQ person who is disabled are colored by the fact that he is white, Christian, and wealthy. So it goes back and forth. It intersects. No two people's experiences are totally alike. And most of us have more complex experiences that we have to remember when we go into spaces. It's not in order for us to have oppression Olympics to see who has the most oppression in order to speak. Is so that we understand that, one, we may not see everybody's experiences on the outside, but there are things that definitely impact the way we are experiencing things. A couple of those that are really important to remember are race, class, and gender. Race in particular is going to impact everything we talk about. So Black and brown people are experiencing everything through being Black and brown. And being white, we experience everything from being white. So let's talk about what's going on. We are seeing a backlash to progress and fear of people in power losing that power. Christian nationalists, white supremacists, and other members of the right in the United States have joined forces to eliminate LGBTQ plus people from public life. And the backlash really starts with marriage equality for LGBTQ people passing in 2015 through the Supreme Court. And you can see that the White House lit up on that day. That was the Obergefell ruling, and it made LGBTQ people able to access the benefits of marriage throughout the country. At the same time, offices within President Obama's administration determined that SOGI, like we talked about earlier, was a protected status, as did the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Health and Human Services, and Housing and Urban Development. And some of these were overturned with President Trump's administration. And it's important to remember that we do not have codified protections for employment, housing, public accommodations, credit, jury service, or some other areas through legislation. We do have employment protections currently through the Supreme Court of the United States through the June 2020 decision Bostock v. Clayton County. Now, we know through cases like Roe v. Wade that Supreme Court decisions are not necessarily permanent. So we have to be diligent of understanding what our rights are. Again, you may be protected at the local, state level, depending on where you live, but most LGBTQ people are not protected through law at the federal level. Censorship is a historical type of backlash as well. For instance, after the Civil War, there was censorship in the South of anti-slavery rhetoric and textbooks. We still see that today. And it all comes through the idea that indoctrination of Southern school children with aristocratic social values. And if you look at that phrase, it looks very similar to phrases that we're seeing and hearing now: indoctrination. And then aristocratic social values, for me, conjures the idea of the liberal elite. We are seeing today backlash on so-called critical race theory, or any kind of racially accurate historical education or diversity education. We're seeing censorship on all of that as a backlash to the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, as well as other Black Lives Matter uprisings in years prior. In the 80s, we started seeing classroom censorship bills in response to AIDS and HIV efforts, and that limited instruction on LGBTQ topics in public education. And we saw the rise of no promo homo laws that are still present in 4 states, including Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. And these are the predecessor to what we're seeing today, called colloquially referred to as Don't Say Gay bills. In 2021 and 2022, state legislators across the country filed around 400 bills attacking LGBTQ plus people and historically accurate curriculum around the history of race in the U.S. Now, the reason there are 2 years here is because states do their legislative sessions differently. In my state of North Carolina, we have a short session and a long session. The long session is every odd year, and it's a time to put the budget together and file any major bills. In the short session, you technically are not allowed to file bills in the alternating years, but you can strip existing bills and put another bill in. The short session is supposed to be shorter, not necessarily that way anymore. And it's supposed to be primarily for finalizing the budget, and like local appropriations bills. So when you see the years together, that's what that's referring to, is that it's kind of 1 year in a lot of places across the country. Here you see a chart of the ways the numbers have moved. So 2015, you see laws starting with, and this is 2015 to 2016, you start seeing laws in response to marriage. And one of those laws that we saw was HB2. That was actually a backlash law in North Carolina to a local non-discrimination ordinance. Again, just an example of a backlash. And then in 2018, President Trump was president. And so there was a lot more restriction on LGBTQ protections at the federal level, and we didn't see as many bills filed. In 2021 and 2022, we started seeing backlash again, and we saw over 400 bills filed. And so far in 2023, we've seen 409 bills as of March 14th. Recent trends in legislation seek to prohibit access to gender-affirming medical care, prohibit transgender athletes from participating in sports, prohibiting transgender access to gendered facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms, allowing providers to cite religious or ethical beliefs, refusing medical care, limiting teaching on race, gender equity, and more accurate history, banning or severely limiting drag performances, which also attacks people on the grounds of cross-dressing, which has been a law in this country, and is part of the reason Stonewall happened, because of police raids on, quote, cross-dressers that they were throwing in jail. I want to mention the gender affirming medical care. In 2021, North Carolina found the most extreme version of this. It didn't become law, but it would have banned gender affirming care up to age 21. In Oklahoma this year, we saw a bill trying to ban it up to age 26. %70 of the bills target LGBTQ plus youth in K through 12 schools, and that includes curriculum and instruction censorship, including prohibiting textbooks or materials on LGBTQ plus themes, requiring parent permission for school clubs, don't say gay bills up to 8th grade, and that includes even mentioning teachers, even mentioning they have a spouse, public access to instructional materials, meaning that teachers would have to make their curriculums, their lesson plans, their books, all of that publicly accessible for scrutiny. And I'll also add that recently we've seen, over the last few years, states and local school districts determining that they wanted to opt out of surveys. So one of those surveys is the CDC's Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, and this is something that we use really to see how marginalized students are experiencing school. And data is something that is really necessary when we are making law or considering treatment or interventions for youth in particular, but marginalized people across the lifespan. Some school districts had already made it opt out, like parents could opt students out of this survey or other surveys. Some districts just stopped doing it altogether. Some states now are requiring parents to opt in, which obviously is going to greatly reduce the amount of participation. And some are doing away with it altogether. So essentially erasing LGBTQ students from the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, meaning that we don't have the information in order to help with health interventions and other types of interventions. I mentioned I want to go back. Here you'll see keywords, and these are words that you may see pop up in laws and bills that sound good, but they are kind of dog whistles to say what we are talking about, to say that these are anti-LGBTQ bills. Indoctrination obviously is not a good bill, but if you see it, like people referring to it, they're referring to not doing indoctrination. We know indoctrination happens in the schools, but it's often on behalf of power, on behalf of white history, on behalf of the victors. So indoctrination, parents' choice, parents' rights, curriculum transparency, all of these sound really great. It doesn't take into consideration that parents already have choices, parents already have rights, and that it creates the idea that teachers are hiding things from parents, and that something is intentionally nefarious happening in the school system. And when we're talking about restrictions on gender affirming care, some keywords that show up are vulnerable children, mutilation, and experimentation. And in the bills that we even see these in headlines. I saw a headline today from a local newspaper that said that our lawmakers disagree on trans athletics, parents' rights. And that's upsetting because parents have rights, but also because it makes it sound like those politicians don't agree with parental rights, simply because that's what the bill is called. They don't agree with that bill, but they believe that parents have rights and that the parents should have rights. Here we're talking about sports and athletic bans, and several of these are moving this year. And the orange states are states that currently ban trans students from participating in sports, and the beige ones are states without laws that ban student athletes from participating. Now, There are a lot of times administrative offices like high school athletic associations that will work with students and a care team to make sure they are um, on playing for the team that feels most appropriate in alignment with that school district's policies. But overall, it's important to remember that these are minors, these are children, and they are playing to learn things like teamwork, physical wellness, um, perseverance, all kinds of lessons that you learn from participating in sports. And only a small minority are actually participating for scholarships. And we aren't seeing an actual competition for scholarships in athletics where trans people are in any way interfering with the ability for students to win scholarships. And if they are participating simply as a member of their team. Also, it's important to remember that when we see these key words, fairness, women's rights, students' rights, we believe in fairness, women's rights, and students' rights. But you see a lot of the people who are actually protesting the trans students participating in their sports, you actually you would notice that a lot of those folks have never supported women's sports, and may even be actively anti-women's rights. Here you can kind of see an overall policy tally of where states are right now as far as safety and legislation. A lot of these are subject to change. We have seen a few positive bills passed in some states like Michigan. So Michigan will be darker green now. So other states will be changing. I think if there was a color darker than red, Arkansas, Tennessee would also have those. Some of the factors that are really playing into legislation are just the increase in rhetoric that's being used to talk about LGBTQ people, LGBTQ students, drag performers, an uptick in groomer rhetoric, which is rhetoric we haven't heard in decades. And then obviously the rhetoric is used as red meat for legislation and for elections. We see the rhetoric also impacting safety and violence, protesting at LGBTQ events. Drag queens in particular have been getting threats for a year or more now, and a decrease in LGBTQ mental health. What you see here on the right side is a photo from a school board meeting in New Hanover County, North Carolina, where there was a decision made last year to allow middle school students to play on the team that aligned with their gender identity. Now, this was a non-issue. There were no students at the time that met this criteria. But the new school board was taken over by Moms for Liberty, and they all won their elections, and then they came in to undo a lot of the work that previous school boards had done. Now, these were decisions that previous school boards had made to protect future youth. As students learn more and more about who they are and what their options are, and as parents support their students more, these are things that need to be available to students. And North Carolina protects high school students and has a policy for high school students to play on this team that aligns with their gender identity so far. But this school board really wanted to make it very safe for all students. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this photo is these are Proud Boys in the background. And to their right, there are actually several LGBTQ protesters as well. These Proud Boys are in their quote uniforms. They're yellow and black. They have their shirts on. This sparked a conversation about masks. about what kinds of masks are okay in school, in public meetings. So you see people with masks to protect themselves from infectious disease and COVID and protect others. And then you have the Proud Boy mask. And can you differentiate between those two in our current political climate? And then you also will see um, signs that say stop trying to erase women, keep female sports female, keep boys out of the girls' locker room. And while these signs sound like they're protecting women, it's important to remember that the Proud Boys was created specifically as a misogynist organization, as a men's rights quote unquote organization, which would be like saying a white rights organization. And they have no interest in protecting women's sports. As a result of anti-LGBTQ policy and debate in the past year, you can see here that LGBTQ youth are really struggling. 86% of trans plus youth say that anti-trans bills have negatively impacted their mental health. 45% of trans youth experience cyberbullying. This is all in the last year. Nearly 1 in 3 reported not feeling safe to go to the doctor or hospital when they were sick or injured. 75% of LGBTQ youth say that both anti-LGBTQ hate crimes and threats of violence against LGBTQ spaces often give them stress or anxiety. And at least 70% of LGBTQ youth say issues like efforts to restrict abortion access, gun violence, police brutality, and not having enough money often give them stress and anxiety. So not just the LGBTQ stuff, but general society concerns. I also want to add 60% of LGBTQ youth who wanted mental health care last year were not able to get it. 1 in 5 trans youth, white trans youth, attempted suicide last year. 1 in 4 Black trans youth attempted suicide last year, and half of all trans youth seriously considered or attempted suicide. But there are things that we can do. One is to pay attention to what's going on. So the ACLU is one organization that is tracking anti-LGBTQ bills. If you type in ACLU anti-LGBTQ bills tracking, you will actually get this page. It'll say how many bills have been filed so far, in what states, and what the categories are, and where those bills are in the process of being made into law. Equality Federation also has an ongoing tracker. This tracker is a little different from the ACLU one, and actually goes into some other issues as well, including race specific issues, reproductive justice, and both serve their purposes in different ways. I think both are good to use side by side. So what you can do is look at equalityfederation.org and go to their about page and then their members and see if there are any members in your state. So there may be an Equality Florida or Georgia Equality or other organizations not named Equality that are in this organization that are listed for you. And those are going to be people that you can reach out to and say, hey, what's going on in our state? How can I help? ACLU statewide chapters also are a great resource, especially if you don't have an LGBTQ political arm. And if you can't find an Equality Federation organization or an ACLU state chapter, you can look on Facebook for LGBTQ in your city or county, or in Google for different organizations. So you can track your local legislation. You can call and email appropriate community members and your representatives. You can write op-eds. Op-eds are really great. I have done federal non-discrimination work, and clergy in particular really get placed quite prominently in national newspapers when they write op-eds, and I think this is a good time for another one. We haven't seen one in a while. We saw a lot in favor of federal non-discrimination, but this would be a really great time for a national op-ed. Letters to the editor are very important and pretty low barrier. Your local paper's website should have a way to send a letter to the editor and tell you the parameters, how many words. Hold press conferences with local clergy to talk about your issues. Bring your local clergy together and bring impacted people and LGBTQ organizations together just to talk about the current bills moving in your state and what you want to do about them. Keep your community up to date and informed, whether that's a congregation or your local community, and mobilize them to do any of these things. And you can also visit your representatives, either virtually or in person. And then when you're talking about this content, you can apply this in any kind of outward messaging, whether you're doing a sermon or other kind of message. If you want a guest speaker to talk on these issues, if you want to include it in your newsletter, your social media, any opportunity with an audience, this is a really great opportunity to uplift actions you can take. Here, I've just shared a page from the North Carolina legislature to also help with tracking. Your state should have a page like this, and you can just look up your General Assembly or your state and current legislation, and it should come to a page similar to this, where you can look up by number, by bill text, or by keyword, like we talked about. What has been filed every day in the House or in the Senate, where bills are in certain committees. And when you find a certain bill you want to follow, it'll actually have all the steps that bill has been through and where it's going next. It's also important to create a safe and inclusive space. So make sure that you are sharing your values and commitments publicly, making people aware that your space is safe, and you are going to work to make sure that it is continuously safe. And that includes things like rainbow flags and showing up at Pride, but also making sure that there are processes for when safety is violated. So if somebody has harmed someone, having a plan of restorative justice, but not being punitive, so that people have an opportunity to learn or to find a new community. Transformative justice, on the other hand, creates an environment where less harm is likely to occur. And we can work with you to make sure your community is set up to protect people from harm in the first place. And there's a lot to inclusion and safe and inclusive spaces. These are very brief. Like I've said a couple of times, these are just one-off ways of making your space more obviously safe now. But I also want to encourage you to consider, is your space safe in comparison with how much you are flagging that it is safe? Because if you're saying this is a safe space, everybody's wearing their pronouns, but in actuality, we don't use people's pronouns. We don't use gender inclusive language. People have to use certain bathrooms. You won't hear us talk about gay couples. You, like, whatever the context is, do a pre-audit in your head when you're thinking about how much you want to flag that your space is safe. And again, this is the role of our organization, is to help you come to a place where your space can be safe and accessible. And here we talk about pronouns. Pronouns are a great signifier that you are safe, that you're going to refer to people the way they want to be referred to. And instead of asking people first what their pronouns are, which may be offensive to people because they may not know that this is a practice you have, always start with my pronouns are. So I am Artie. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. What are yours? So I know how to refer to you. And understand that you may think someone looks like they have certain pronouns, but they may not be the right pronouns for that person. So don't ever think that you can assume someone's pronouns. Another instance is wearing your pronouns. So some congregations use badges that you can get when you're a member, or a name tag, sticky tag. There's also buttons that people wear on their lapels, on their ties, on their lanyards that have their pronouns on them. And there are organizations that give them away for free. This is a screenshot from Etsy that has lots of different examples, but there are plenty more. One thing that I want to flag for this is that some of these are very obvious, right? So the one that says, that's a black circle with the gold that says my pronouns are, is very easy to read for most people. The ones in the top right corner, while they're very artsy, they may not be able to read. People may not be able to read them, and they are less accessible and not really serving their purpose. You might want them because they're cute, and a community member might want them because they, feel like they're part of a community when they wear them. But when you're thinking about what people are seeing and how they are interacting with you, consider that it needs to be legible. And then email signatures. For instance, here I have my email signature, they, them, theirs. I actually have a link in this that says, "What's this?" And it goes to a page that talks about what pronouns are, so people can click on it and learn more about what pronouns are. Um, and you could, I mean, that could say anything. It could say, what are pronouns? Or you could just link your pronouns, like put the link over your pronouns and people could click it. In addition, for making a safe space, like I've said, use appropriate and respectful language. Don't make assumptions. Remember, coming out is sacred, intimate, and lifelong. And don't out people without their consent. Authenticity is a gift that people are giving you when they are being their full selves. It means they feel safe and they are allowing you to experience their full humanity. You can show friendly curiosity like you would with anyone, but be don't be invasive, right? Like, there are questions that you wouldn't ask any other person. Don't ask LGBTQ people those questions. And then treat people like they belong. If you are gonna greet everyone, greet everyone. If you're gonna invite folks out to lunch, feel free, like, invite people. You don't have to invite everyone, but don't make it a special burden to include people. Just be polite. Again, there's so much more to this that can really enrich your space, but for right now, these are really great guidelines. And then these are some symbols that you may want to display in your space. The first one is the progress flag. This is the most common LGBTQ flag you'll see now. In other sessions, we talk about the history and the evolution of the flag, but this is the progress flag. It shows how the trans flag, which is the one in the middle, the colors in the middle, as well as Black and brown people, intersect with the LGBTQ community and are part of it, and are the foundations of our community, really. The inverted pink triangle is the symbol given to gay men in concentration camps during World War II. It has also been reclaimed during the AIDS epidemic, and you'll see it now for especially political groups that have more of a activist stance. This has been, while it was primarily for men, it's been reclaimed by many of the people in the LGBTQ community, especially in times of genocide and mass death and resilience. In the Holocaust, however, lesbians were marked with a inverted black triangle, as were other, quote, asocial people like nomads, homeless people. Yeah. Again, to increase your safe space outreach, you could attend LGBTQ community events like prides, invite guest speakers and host other internal events open to the public. So if you want to have an event that's a movie screening, you can invite the public to that event. You can have a speaker on this topic and open that to the public, and people will see that gesture. Share your space with LGBTQ groups. We often don't have places to meet in third places, and we are increasingly pushed out of public. So having places to gather is very great. Like support groups or youth groups, P flags. A lot of these groups are searching for places to meet. And then again, include your inclusive message in your social media, your website, your newsletter, and advertisements. And that's it for our content. Here are some great ways to find us. We have 2 Facebook pages, Pride Education Services and Project Embodied Welcome. Both of those are also on Instagram. You can see our tags there. On TikTok, we are also Embodied Welcome. We have a private Facebook group for LGBTQ plus and affirming church leaders, and you can see our website and email address there. Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure, and I hope that this has served you in needing this moment for your LGBTQ community members, and that we can continue to work together. And please reach out if there is anything that you need or want to work on. Again, I'm Artie Hartzell with Pride Education Services and Project Project Embodied Welcome, and it's been great. Thank you so much, and have a great week.